Nicholas Payton, how are you doing?
I'm cool, Sean. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this. I've been a fan of yours for a long time. In particular, when I was in college, there's a few of your recordings that were really formative. And so Gumbo, Nouveau, Peyton's Place, and Nick at Night in particular. All of your recordings are great. You've been such a tremendously influential player, and it's definitely have motivated me and inspired me.
Thank you.
Yeah, uh, I was taking a look at some. I like to do a little bit of research when I interview, and I noticed that I thought that you were a little older than you are. We're only a year apart, and almost exactly a year apart because
Mm.
you're a Libra, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, me too. So I was born in '74.
Okay.
Yeah,
What date?
so October 17th.
Okay, that's close to Hargrove, I think. No, that's close to Winton. He's 18.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
somebody told me that Winton's birthday was on the 18th.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. My mother's birthday is on the 21st, and I have a lot of friends that, for whatever reason, that about that time, for some reason, it just happens that way.
A lot of musicians are in that area.
Yeah, Coltrane, of course.
Coltrane, Sonny Rollins,
Yeah.
Gary Bartz and I actually share a birthday, the
Oh, how about that?
26th. And as uh, my mother, we are born on the same day, and her brother, my uncle, we're all born on the same day.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, goodness, I mean, we could talk about so much. So, maybe for folks that, I mean, there's some biographical things I think maybe we could talk about a little bit. So, when did you start playing? And what were some of the sounds that you heard around the house that were motivating factors? Or what kind of music was going on? And yeah, those kinds of things.
Mm. Well, I was born in New Orleans into a musical family. Obviously, New Orleans is a hotbed of music and culture. Um, this music started there, really. Greats from the fabled Buddy Bolden to Bunk Johnson to Freddie Keppert, Sidney Bechet, King Oliver, and of course Louis Armstrong, the original king of pop. So many uh, pivotal and influential musicians throughout the course and the history of Black music have been from New Orleans. So I grew up in that vortex, as well as directly having it in my own home. My father, Walter Payton, bassist, sousaphonist, played on a lot of early New Orleans R&B hits like Lee Dorsey, Working on the Coal Mine, Aaron Neville, Tell It Like It Is. He's on the LaBelle's um, Nightbirds album. He's not on the Lady Marmalade track, but he is on that album. Um, my mother is a classical pianist, operatic singer. Her father, my grandfather, was a classical pianist. A lot of my uncles on my mother's side are pianists. And I'm told on my father's side, on the Payton side, there was a luthier, a string instrument player and manufacturer who was compatriots with Buddy Bolden. So music goes on both sides of my family quite extensively. So from the beginning, it's always been a part of my life, and I heard everything. Uh, I can't say really any particular genre classification, if you will, but just that there was always music and musicians around the house from early on. There was always instruments around, and as soon as I could crawl up on something, I was playing it. Long before I made the conscious thought that I was playing music, and certainly well before thinking about it professionally. So it's always been a part of my life.
Now, did you take lessons?
Yes. I actually started on Suzuki violin, and it was very short lived. Um, and I asked my father for a trumpet, and he got me one for my fourth year that Christmas. And I've pretty much been playing ever since, with the exception of like a year or two around fifth or sixth grade where I played tuba for 2 years. Um, so yeah, my father pretty much guided me until I was about 8 years old. And he, at that point, not being a trumpet player, felt that he got me as far as he could. So started me taking trumpet lessons at Xavier University, which is where my parents both went to college and actually where they met, with a trumpeter by the name of E. Diane Lau. She's a female trumpeter, and she was my first trumpet teacher. And but I wasn't really studious then. You know, playing for me was recreational. And at the point of which now I had to start taking lessons every week, it became a task, and my interest sort of waned a little bit. Um, but I eventually came around to it on my own, and it stuck ever since.
Now, now, when did you know that music was going to be? I mean, that music was going to be a significant thing, not just a significant thing, but was going to be a career
A
path. Was going to
career,
be,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That was about 11 years old, and I had already started gigging. In fact, I joined a youth brass band called the All Star Brass Band. James Andrews was the leader. James Andrews is actually Trombone Shorty's eldest brother, trumpet player. And
Yeah.
I started doing gigs around town and in the neighborhood. I was living in the Treme neighborhood, which is right across the street from the French Quarter, which is right across the street from Congo Square and Armstrong Park. A lot of the brass bands are based out of the Treme area. So I was gigging quite a bit. This is around 10, 11. And James heard that I played. So he came to my house one day, knocked on the door, and asked my father, could I join their band? And my father was like, yeah, it's cool. And it was kind of funny because nobody asked me. It was almost like an arranged marriage situation or something. And I started playing with those guys every day. And it still hadn't crystallized yet. And because I started gigging and playing more often and started endeavoring towards a professional career, I was like, well, my father had this vast record collection that I never really bothered to delve into on my own. I had my own records. I was into hip hop and Michael Jackson and all that stuff. So I never really bothered to listen to my father's records. I heard the music because it was playing around the house, but I never made a conscious effort to listen to his stash of albums. So one day, just out of curiosity, I was like, well, I'm playing this music. I'm starting to do gigs. Let me see what my father's collection is talking about. So I was thumbing through his albums, various names that I recognized, and I came across an album by Miles Davis called Four and More. Like, I recognized Miles as a trumpet player. I was like, okay, let me check this out. And I actually put it on side 2 first because 4 is actually on the B side of the album. And from the moment, Tony comes in with like this 8-bar drum thing, I was sold before even Miles came in. Just Tony's touch and the way he set that intro up. It was a defining moment. Though I had been around music my whole life, it was at that moment I was like, this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. And that was it.
That's a great memory. You know, when I try to think of... I trust that you've enjoyed the video so far. Please subscribe, comment, share, like, and also you can go over to my Patreon. The link is in the description if you'd like to further support. Thank you. Now back to the video. Try to think of when I knew I was going to do music. I don't actually remember a time when I wasn't going to do music. And I think stuff maybe took more shape as to what the particulars were going to be as time went on. But there's a lot of memories that I just don't have. I don't remember. You know, I remember loving Sonny Stitt, you know, really being turned on by Sonny Stitt. I remember hearing those Miles Davis recordings with Coltrane and Cannonball. You know, I remember the sort of aesthetic of that, but I don't have like clear like memories of, you know, of when, you know, certain things kind of turned on for me. And actually, because of that, I actually interviewed my dad, because my dad was my teacher. And he was my teacher all the way until I went to college. And he had, you know, a particular philosophy and different things he was trying to get at. And so kind of digging into some of that was pretty interesting. Speaking of my father, who managed my career all the way until I was, you know, 30 years old almost. When I was a kid, and I was going to these IAJE conferences, you know, of course, he was always
actually
there.
where I first met you.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's Yep. And that's what I was. And I think the way that it worked was, I think maybe I met Tim Warfield first, and then he introduced us.
Yeah.
Something like that. And you know, Tim has been, because he's on a couple of those records that I mentioned before, and Tim has been also very influential in my playing. So in your, what are you sort of, what is your writing influenced by? Like, what are you thinking about now, and maybe what were you thinking about maybe historically, and has there been some development as far as the, I'm sure there has been. I'm just trying to, I'm just setting, yeah. I'm just setting you up. What kind of developments have you tried to incorporate more into your music now? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think it depends on what stage we're talking about. I think when I first started writing music, it was basically like things that I heard, like melodies that I heard that resonated with me in some kind of way. That might have been loosely based on things that I've shedded or standards, various tunes, so forth. But I didn't really, when I started writing, I didn't think of composition as a voice. You know, it just seemed like perhaps something I should do based on a lot of the artists that I was checking out. I noticed that, hey, they wrote music, so maybe I should write music too. But I really wasn't very confident in my writing early on. And I think how I got to develop more confidence in my composition was through transcription, transcribing a lot of Monk. Miles, again, was my absolute favorite artist, still is. And transcribing various tunes he played, or trying to pick out various voicings from his pianists, which were always impeccable, from Red Garland to Wynton Kelly to Herbie Hancock. I learned so much just from trying to figure out how they voiced chords and figuring out the chords from, for the songs I was learning, figuring out how to structure chords from what his pianists were doing. and then I started arranging a lot.
Now, do you write from the piano? Is that kind of where you write from?
Primarily, but the initial inspiration may not come from the piano.
Right.
But when I got to college, is really where I started developing, I think, a voice as a composer out of necessity and out of resource, basically, because I went to University of New Orleans. Ellis Marcellus, rest in peace, was my combo instructor. And basically, nobody was doing anything. Ellis had a very loose approach to teaching, so he didn't come in there with a lesson plan and say, you have to do this, this, or the other. So realizing that we were kind of just sitting around playing tunes, I said, well, I'm going to make this my compositional workshop. And what I began to do was every Tuesday and Thursday in combo, I would bring in different arrangements, different tunes that I was writing or working on in different arrangements. And because I had that controlled experiment at my disposal, I knew every Tuesday and Thursday this instrumentation would be there, because you know how hard it is to get cast together. Hey, come over and play my tunes or whatever. And you ain't got no bread. You know what I mean? It's hard to get cast together. So it's like, man, I'm just gonna exploit this. I know these cats are gonna be here twice a week, every week. So I just made it my own personal workshop because no one else was utilizing. So that's really where I feel like I honed at least the foundation of my compositional chops. Which led into, after my first semester, actually my only semester in college, right before my second semester, I joined Elvin Jones. And that was the first really big road gig that I had. And that college experience transitioned into Elvin's band, which had a three-man front line, and I started just understanding and transcribing Blakey and all the great three horn ensembles and figuring out how to orchestrate from there. And I just expanded from there.
Yeah, I hope my students are listening right now, because this advice that you just gave about making a combo experience, make it your workshop, your writing workshop, that's something that I tell them all the time. I'm glad to hear you second the motion there.
Because as you know, you'll never get that again. Even as a band leader well into my career, it's hard for me to get my cast together. Maybe we get together on a sound check, or if I can, perhaps a day or so, or a couple days before a gig, I'm having to spend bread for hotel, travel, or whatever before the gig. College is free. You have those cats for free. And I just use it. And no one told me that. I just was like, well, no one else is doing anything. I'm going to use it. So.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. That's great advice. So people know you most for playing trumpet.
I would say so. Yeah.
But you're a fine keyboard player. What, you play any other instruments?
Bass, drums, little sax, trombone, tuba, as I said earlier. And really how I became proficient at a lot of different instruments. One, growing up in a household with a lot of different instruments, having parents who played different instruments. And my father was also the band teacher at the elementary school I went to.
Right.
So I would hang out after school waiting for him to go home. Sitting there, I had a whole band room full of instruments, and to pass the time by, I just started messing around on different stuff. And after a while, I developed enough proficiency that my father saw, that he basically gave me a job after school to tutor the beginning band students to get them ready to transition them into the band. So to as you know, as a teacher, is one thing to have a level of proficiency on your own, but to be able to impart understanding to someone else, you have to understand it on a deeper level. So it really uh, taught me how to investigate the inner workings
Yeah.
of instrumentalism. And again, I'm not thinking that I'm going to be a professional musician one day and I'm going to be a band leader and it's going to help me to understand the bass and this and that and the other. But it did. It seemed predestined that all these things were working together to conspire to set me up for where I am right now.
Yeah. In my own writing, I'm a multi-instrumentalist and I play, you know, and I tell folks, sometimes like if you people ask you, okay, so what do you play? And then I'll just keep it simple. I play saxophone. Because often I don't want to get into the, oh, you play so many instruments and all this kind of thing, because it's not really about that.
Right.
It's more about, it's really utilitarian. It's like, I want to work, and so I do what's necessary to be able to work. And I've learned different instruments, first because I had a passion for those instruments. I was interested in them, and in particular, because I wanted to become a better writer, better composer for those instruments. So, for instance, guitar, I play guitar, but the reason I started playing guitar was not because I wanted to, take that on as another, instrument to play on gigs. The reason I did it was because I was working at a church. It's a big evangelical church, really guitar driven kind of thing. And I was writing a lot of music for them. I was like, wait a minute, I'm writing all this stuff. I want to understand the guitar better. And so then I just started learning how to play guitar. And then I fell in love with guitar. So that's, kind of how that's gone. And that's not, I didn't make that up. That's like a, like an old classical composer, strategy, to dealing with stuff. If you're going to write a clarinet concerto, with the sort of intricacies,
right.
And really exploiting the instrument, then you're going to have to do something.
Yeah. It helps to understand the inner workings of that instrument. And I think for me, the big sell was an album and a movie in particular that really inspired me was Purple Rain. I was really into that movie. I was really into Prince, so much so that my mom bought me as a gift the piano book for the soundtrack, all the tunes.
Oh, really?
And in the intro of the book, I remember reading that, it said Prince played 20 instruments. And to me, that just like blew my mind. I was like, that's the genius of this guy. He plays all these different things. So that really inspired me to go hard in that band room and pick up the clarinet and pick up the sax and pick up the trombone and the baritone and all these different things, drums, so forth. Because I was like, wow, if Prince is doing this and I could feel and hear the scope and the breadth of his artistry, there's something to that. And then around the same time, I also learned that Stevie Wonder had played a lot of the stuff on his classic albums that I really loved. He was an early influence too. So between Prince and Stevie, learning that basically they could make an album by themselves. That was all I needed to hear to embark upon this multi-instrumentalist thing.
And in the Black community, it's almost a cliche. You have a lot of Black musicians play a lot of instruments, especially cats coming out of church. I mean, Definitely. At least they'll be able to, play all the rhythm section instruments, all the critical instruments, in that setting. And although I don't really play brass instruments, I am. Let's see here. See, it's wedged under here. Which you can tell I don't actually play it then. No. Well, I have my trumpet, and I made a deal with Dwight Adams.
Oh, that's my dude.
Yeah, so I made a deal with him. So, his kids are older than mine. My son is, but when my son was just, 1, he's 6 now. It's going to be 7 next month. I wanted to, if he was going to play trumpet, and he illustrated, he did some things that were interesting to me. He was about 1.5, and he picked my trumpet up, and he got a sound out of it.
Mm.
And so I was like, okay, well, let's see what's up with this. So anyhow, I made this deal with Dwight, and so our deal was basically, if I give him saxophone and he gives me a trumpet, and then we're supposed to do like some Skype lessons. And he's going to teach me, and we haven't really gotten to it because I was in the middle of a degree program and some other stuff, and so that kind of went to the wayside. But the trumpet is constantly sitting there. This is a French Besson. It's constantly sitting there, reminding me, asking me to pick it up, but I haven't picked it up much. But yeah, but I've played with some really terrific trumpet players, and so for that reason, I was really kind of interested in the instrument, and I write for trumpet and brass instruments quite often, and that was another reason why I was like, okay, let me see what this thing is about. All right, so do you have any hobbies?
Good question. I'm not necessarily a music nerd in the sense of every aspect of my life is music, because I ultimately feel that to be well-rounded musically, you have to have a life outside of the music that serves as inspiration to it. So I've had various disciplines and things that I've studied, I guess, along the way, be it reading. I love to read functional books too. Like, I'm not too much into fiction, but spiritual books about different spiritual traditions or philosophy. I had a very heavy period. I was into meditation and Zen, not so much from a religious perspective as just a body-mind science, that this works, that focusing on the breath and working on quieting the mind, you can become a vessel for these things which you aspire to espouse. And I think all of these practices, I was into martial arts and karate early on. My father was actually a black belt. So being around him, I actually inherited that. Played soccer. But by and large, I'm kind of an introvert. So I'm not like the party goer. I'm not a big hanger. I like a very close, small, tight-knit group of friends and people who I hang with, and socialize in that aspect. And I think because so much of my life is public and having to deal with people, I appreciate the quiet moments. So even just being in my home to me is a vacation, which is, for me, this quarantine situation has not been as difficult for
That's
me
where I was about to go.
as it is perhaps for some, because I'm a recluse anyway. So I'm just
I was just about to go there. I'm an introvert also, and same kind of deal. And with teaching and everything else, performing, all the other things that are going on, people always involved with that stuff. And so if I went to they have these things called mixers. If I went to a mixer, if I stayed at the mixer for an hour, I would probably need a day of sleep.
Yeah.
To recover.
To recharge your energy. Yeah, it's very taxing.
Yeah.
To do for me, and I do it fairly well, but ultimately I'm a pretty shy person, and it's often taken as me being aloof or vibey, and it's not really that. I'm not a social butterfly in that way. If the conversation is natural and we flow and there's a connection, sure, I can talk your ear off. But I don't necessarily have that immediacy with everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole small talk thing for
Yeah, me
me.
too. I'm not good at it, man. If I don't have anything to say, I'm just quiet, and I'm comfortable with it. Like
Yeah.
the silence doesn't make me. As I've gotten older, I've felt more compelled because I see other people are uncomfortable with the silence to step out of myself to make other people comfortable. But really, the small talk thing is not, it's not my bag.
Yeah, it's the small talk thing to me is how much can we talk about the weather before we actually start talking about
The real
substance?
stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And even if that's something like what causes different weather formations and the science of weather, the fact that it seems like the meteorologists get the weather wrong more often than they get it right,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. And of course, that goes way deeper than most people want or are comfortable with.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that. I struggle when I discover someone. So if I'm in sort of a desert, so a mixer to me is like a desert. So if I'm in this desert and then finally someone says something and I can get with it,
Yeah.
then I have to like really be conscious of how deep I get,
Yeah.
because I just want to just talk. I just want to, let's get into it. Let's do some work.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. So yeah, I totally get that. And for me, this quarantine has been, there've been a couple things that I've missed. Obviously, being on the stage in front of an audience, there's just nothing like that. That's like
Mm-hmm.
my absolute favorite thing, about what it is that I do is just being able to share music with other folks that are receptive. That's just a beautiful thing. And going to the gym for what was it, 3 months or something. All the gyms are all locked up and everything. And I live in Ohio, so actually, this is the 6th week that the gyms have been back open. At least the gym that I go to, and so that's been helpful, because that's like a really big stress relief for me. And I've got some gym buddies, and so being able to hang out with them a little bit and stuff. But honestly, other than those things, I've been totally straight. I can just be down in the studio. I've had a number of projects that I've been working on, and actually I feel like I've gotten a lot of work done.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've put out a couple of albums since the quarantine. Embarking on a couple of other projects. I have a few in the can. So for me, and I get, and no judgment, everybody works different. I know some people, some artists, some musicians in particular, don't feel too inspired at all to create. And I think that's fine. You don't have to, whatever. I'm the kind of person, though, that like when calamity strikes, I throw myself headlong into something, in a project, and it just helps me. It's therapeutic for me. But I think everyone has to find what works for them. And I don't think there's a right or wrong way to approach it. You just have to know yourself and what works for you, that'll get you through. Because certainly I don't think anyone could see this coming with 2020
Yeah.
from the COVID thing. And if that wasn't enough, then this whole thing with the police brutality and the murders of Black people, which has always happened. But I think us being isolated for so long and being in a space where this stuff happened, and we see all this Black death on the 24-hour viral
News
cycle.
cycle.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's like, it was like a powder keg waiting to
Yep.
happen. And unfortunately, it's sad because these are people's sons, brothers, daughters, fathers, that we're still at this point that we were at 60 years ago. Same thing, that we're repeating that. I really hope for society that we use this as a reckoning. Because to me, the question becomes, how many of us have to die for us to see that there's a problem? This is a legitimate issue. This is not a figment of the imagination. This is not exaggeration. This is happening. And it's somewhat comforting for me to see a critical mass approaching, seeing that it's not right. Even though it's been happening all along, I don't think it's any more or any different. However, I do think the isolation and the lockdown provided a meditative silence by which we can now look at this very critically for what it has been for a lot of people. For many of us, we've known it's been what it's been, but for the critical mass to see it. And I pray that we use this as an opportunity to make some real changes on a deep, profound, systemic level, and not just let this be a trend and have it blow over and we go back to business as usual. To me, that would be a waste.
Yeah, it would be a waste. And I'm a realist, and I'm tired of talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm tired of talk. I want to see some walk.
Yeah.
And it's just very frustrating to see the same sorts of things happen over and over. And even protests over, similar kinds of circumstances that fizzle out over time, and the politicians use it as a way to pat themselves on the back and to, show how conscious they are, but then nothing changes. It's the same stuff over and over and over. I'm trying not to allow that to take over any sense of allowing myself to have some hope in this thing.
Yeah, same here.
That things will improve. Yeah.
Same deal.
So let's talk about this shirt you got on, man.
What's up? It ties into this because really the things that I was aspiring to create a dialogue around 10 years ago is what everyone is talking about now. And I was called all kinds of racists and angry and so forth and so on, talking about these issues, which to me were there then. None of this is new. We were still getting brutalized and killed 10 years ago. The only difference is now with the advent of social media, we can see the proliferation quicker and so forth. But again, I just really hope that this isn't a trend, and that we're ready to not only have just dialogue, but that some real change takes place. And again, I'm not, I'm going to tread lightly on this subject. I'm not necessarily a violent person by nature, but I just think it's science, it's math, that you can't just continue to be bullied. I'm encouraged to see Black people stepping up to protect themselves, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So
when the Black American music thing, when you started speaking your mind about that, I was just so happy that somebody was saying it, somebody else was saying it. Things that I just resonate deeply with so many of your ideas. What caused you to just decide that, hey, you know what, it's enough of this. I need to start saying something.
Yeah.
And also the thing where, why did you feel like you needed to take it on yourself to do this? I mean, it's one thing to agree with what it is that you're saying, to believe what it is that you're saying. It's another thing to take it on yourself and say, okay, I'm going to be the person that's doing this then.
Good question. The interesting thing is I had been talking about it for a number of years. People, for whatever reason, didn't really pay attention as to why that particular post called on why jazz isn't cool anymore resonated more than others. Your guess is as good as mine. But I knew when I was writing it that I was onto something. And basically the whole piece, which has been called a manifesto, a poem, all kinds of things, was not conceived as a whole. I was basically in my hotel room before a gig tweeting. And basically every line in that piece is a tweet, because tweets have a 140 character limit. It can only be but so long. So I realized when I was live tweet streaming that there was something about the reactions people were giving me, and that were very polarizing. People were emphatically for it or emphatically against it. They were either way. They fell sharply on one side or the other of the things that I was saying. And when I was done with that stream, I just felt like there's something about this. So I basically copied and pasted every tweet over that hour or so that I was tweeting into a WordPress document and published it. And then that's what it is. And that became that piece that became the genesis of what is now known as the BAM movement, which BAM wasn't even a thing in that piece. I don't even say BAM anywhere. That's something that became later, because people asked me, so if not jazz, what would you call the music? And simply, I just said Black American music. And again, it's not to say who can or can't play it. It's about acknowledging the creators of this art form and why they created it. When we were transported here during colonialism and the enslavement period, we were not allowed to speak our native languages. So we developed a new language in the work song and the field holler and gospel music, which eventually morphed into the blues, which because of a place like Congo Square, which might have been the only place in the US where the enslaved Africans were given a platform and a space to drum and dance and sing and reestablish a link back to Africa, which was sought to be broken by the colonists, because they didn't want us to talk, to be able to communicate, and they certainly didn't want us to know who we were before all of this. Because if we understood that, then we would know all this was a farce and it would liberate us a certain way. But what stood in our favor was they just thought they were giving us Sunday to celebrate. And, they're just singing, it's harmless. But what we were doing was building and rebuilding this link they sought to destroy. And out of that space, out of that cultural vortex, many years later comes Louis Armstrong, who is the first king of popular music, which is an idea that didn't exist before him, largely due to the fact of here was this young man with a new voice, and whose voice coincided with a new technological medium in the phonograph, which allowed everyone all over the world to hear the same piece of music at roughly the same time, which allows it to be pop. And from that, he revolutionized music as we know it today. So even when you listen to whomever you're listening to on pop radio now, everyone owes a debt to Armstrong. He revolutionized the quarter note. He revolutionized swing. He invented a new field. And that's something that doesn't happen often. People make advents in terms of harmony or texture or so forth, but to revolutionize the beat, to revolutionize 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
that hasn't happened many times. Only two times I can think of is Louis Armstrong and perhaps Jay Dilla, where they revolutionized where we feel one. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that, because it's out of that really crafted the first freedoms of those non-white people in society, most of whom have been oppressed, crafted our first freedoms that began to humanize us, if you will, after centuries of the narrative that we were somehow less than. So these artists like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Shavers, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Count Basie, these Black artists, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, are people that the world had to put on the same pedestal as your Beethovens, as your Picassos, as your great artists whom they were respected. And they began breaking down the door for our liberation long before there was an actual civil rights movement. This music was, to me, the first civil rights movement. And it's why it's important, because I think it's the key to not only liberating people of color, but it's also the key to liberating us all, because if we really look at it, most people are slaves to the system. Even the so-called oppressive supremacist class, because you're emboldened to an idea that suffocates. It's not expansive, and it's regressive. So what's beautiful about this time is I think that a critical mass of people are beginning to look at the farce of all of it, the farce of all of it for the last 400 to 500 years. The question is still unanswered: what are we going to do?
Yes, and I am eagerly awaiting the response to that question. You know, you were talking about Louis Armstrong and his influence. One thing, I interviewed Byron Stripling, and one thing that he talks about is Armstrong's concept of vibrato and how that totally changed everything, not just for instrumentalists, but for singers too. Because you can't find another artist that was using a vibrato that way, and then you see this clear line of demarcation.
Yeah.
To all the people that were influenced by Armstrong.
Absolutely.
You're hearing that vibrato.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I teach at a university, and of course I went to university. Went to school, and one thing that always was troubling and to this day is still troubling about the way that so-called jazz music is treated in comparison to European classical tradition. There's a lot of terminology that's used that I don't necessarily think that the people that are using this terminology realize that it's derogatory or it's negative towards jazz.
Yeah.
But it's just so commonly used. Terminology.
Like legit.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Versus, well, if it's not legit, then what is it? You're basically by default saying it's illegitimate.
Right. Or even, referring to jazz musicians as being jazzers.
No. That's just
but
corny.
that's it's corny. And I know you've taken issue with the J word. And I've taken the same issue with the J word. It's not it's not a word that has served us
It,
particularly well.
it really hasn't. No.
There's some pretty sordid etymological meanings of the word.
Hmm.
There is a sort of just by the naming an intended belittlement
Yeah.
of the art.
Hmm.
And when I discuss, and I mean, you see some programs, some jazz studies programs around the country have, I think, being influenced and inspired by the BAM movement, have tried to maybe
Shift
yeah,
away. Yeah.
yeah shift and maybe change the way that they talk about music. It's challenging, and I kind of see both sides of this. I see the side that says J word has never helped us. Let's just scrap that. There's no reason to even use that terminology. It's not particularly descriptive anyway. You know.
Exactly. What are you talking about? Where? What
Yeah.
does it mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And but then I can also see the other side of it. That's like, okay, but you have all these programs that are named a certain thing. You have all of this music that's been categorized in a certain way, although, like we said, it's not particularly descriptive. I mean, I remember, you know, I mean, you don't hear jazz on terrestrial radio very often, but the so-called jazz that was on the radio often would be like instrumental R&B, you
Mhm.
know, or a couple times, I was listening to some kind of station and I was traveling or something. I was driving from Ohio down to Nashville or something. And I was in this radio station, supposedly a jazz radio station. It was like some Tony Braxton, you know, and I love Tony Braxton,
Mhm.
but that's not. I don't think what people. Well, I don't know. Maybe it is what people think of when they say jazz. It's because the word again is so. It's such a wide term that doesn't. It's not very explanatory.
Mhm.
So I kind of can see both sides of this, and it creates a real challenge for administrators that want to be able to make a certain movement because they totally agree with what it is that you're saying, but also are sort of trapped by certain conventions that
Mhm.
prevent that movement.
Mhm.
So,
I will say that first off, and I think this might be perhaps the most understood aspect of BAM, is I've never been on a crusade to change the name jazz to Black American music or
right.
to stop it. I do think that the term is appropriate for certain things. It's not anything I would want to play or be associated with. It's to me quite derogatory and is indicative of minstrelsy, basically.
Hmm.
Um, but if I had to boil it down to the chief issue I have with jazz, especially if we're looking at the educational realm, which is very important. And when I say education, I don't mean just on a collegiate or school uh, pedagog- pedagogical level, but just in terms of the science and the study of what something is and what it means. It's very possible to teach and disseminate and disperse and to perform jazz and never deal with Black people. And I think that's a big problem. Jazz, saying jazz allows you to deal with this music, to commodify it, to perform it, to teach it, to sell it, and never deal with the fact that Charlie Parker was a Black man.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. Not because white people can't play it. And that's always an argument. Well, yeah, there've been many great uh, non-Black musicians within this idiom, many of whom have made significant contributions. But the root and the source of this music and why comes from the Black community for
That's
reasons
right.
aforementioned.
That's
So
right.
if you don't deal with the community, you're missing the soul of it. And
Yep.
we don't do that with anything else. You don't go to culinary school and deal with Italian cuisine and not deal with the Italians. Even if we're going to talk about music, you don't deal with mariachi and not deal with the Mexican people. You don't deal with Celtic music and not deal with the Irish. You're not going to study martial arts and not deal with Asian people. But when
Yeah.
you say jazz, it's just like, oh, we can make it what we want, and everybody can have. You can have this kind of jazz and that kind of jazz, and now it's just a catch-all phrase, and it becomes very bastardized. And I find it to be fundamentally disrespectful, and that's why so many forms of so-called jazz are devoid of the feeling and the soul of the people, is because it has no communal roots. So to me, that's the biggest problem. Look, to be honest, if jazz was healthy and everybody got it and recognized where it came from, I don't think I would have a problem with the usage of the term. But I think essentially, when you say jazz, it has little or nothing to do with Black people in the community. And also, it's fundamentally disrespected. It has negative connotations of houses of ill repute. The
Yep.
musicians are late. They don't show up on time.
That's
They're
right.
drug addicts. You'll never divorce the negative connotations from the word. When you say jazz, it's always going to mean that everyone else can be on the Grammy telecast except jazz. That it's okay if there are only two people in the club. It's okay if you only sell 150 CDs. This
Yeah.
very ghettoized, marginalized concept has become glorified. And really, all it becomes profitable for is the people at the top. The musicians ultimately suffer. Whenever you have a jazz anything, it's okay to treat the music and the artist to give them the least amount, to give
Yeah.
them the least amount of love. I went to a art school, New Orleans Center for the Creative Arts, which is the famed school in New Orleans, which is like LaGuardia School in New York. Those of you who may be old enough to remember the TV show Fame, the movie, this high school, arts high school that creates stars. New Orleans had this very same school here, which produced Branford and Wynton Marsalis and Terence Blanchard and Harry Connick, all these people. I went there many years later. This department was responsible for keeping the lights on of this building. And anyone perhaps who's known from this institution plays so-called jazz music. However, we had the least amount of resources. We were continually disrespected. When there was performance class on Friday, every Friday afternoon, we had to go to the classical performances, but they didn't have to come see us
Yeah.
because we were illegitimate. We were
Yeah.
summarily disrespected all the time, even though we were the real bread and butter. When the rich donors wanted performers for their soirees and their performances, send the jazz students because that's entertaining. That's what people want to see. That's the bread and butter. But when the people donated the actual money, we were the department that didn't have a functioning record player, that had paint chipping off our ceiling. So we're making money for this. We're keeping this whole thing alive. However, we have the least amount of our output. And to me, you'll never get out of this very ghettoized mentality of what jazz means to people. So, and Gary Bartz is really the one who's responsible for opening my eyes to that, because he was the first person I met in real life who used jazz as a term, but it was very disparaging. It was almost like the N-word, how he was saying it was like an epithet. And a light bulb went off because I had been writing about this for years, but I hadn't quite put together that jazz was the problem. And with that meeting with Bartz, and when he was saying, yeah, but they play that jazz, and it was almost like a slur, I was like, wow, jazz is actually the problem. Because we're taught and ingrained that jazz is this monumental thing. It is this treasured, And it's almost, it's weird because it has this dichotomy of being very elitist in one sense, but very ghettoized in another. Jazz musicians think, okay, our music is better than this person's music or that person's music. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be whatever. Like, to me, all these Black musics deserve to be respected and regarded on the same level. I look at Marvin Gaye on the same level I look at Nat King Cole, as the same level I look at Sarah Vaughan, and so forth. They could have all been neighbors, many of them. James Brown could have lived next door to John Coltrane. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. But I think when we get into this thing of dissecting and this hierarchical thing, it's almost back to the plantation where you have the house and the field Negro and so forth. So to me, BAM is about bringing this collective family that we never meant to separate back together. And that it's more about, I think genre classification is a very Western, European system. And I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but it's just not typically how Black people think. With Black culture, with African culture, it's about territory, where you're from, and from whom you come. Is it New Orleans music? Is it Kansas City style? Is it Detroit? Is it West Coast? Is it New York? Is it Florida, like the Adderley brothers? Is it St. Louis, like Miles and Clark Terry? Who and where, what territory, what tribe, what part of Africa you come from, and who's your master teacher? That's more in line with our aesthetic as far as saying it's hip hop, it's funk, it's blues, it's whatever. Because, if we're really being experimental, people of our age, we grew up listening to different stuff than Charlie Parker. If we're being honest, the music we play should be more inclusive of the things we grew up hearing and being socialized in. That's no disrespect to Charlie Parker, and it's not either or. It's, we can play bebop, and we can fuse it with Motown, and we can fuse it with hip hop, and we can fuse it with R&B. All these things can coexist in the same space, and that's what BAM is about. So when people ask me, the jazz elitist mindset always wants to separate itself. Well, what do we call jazz? How do we distinguish ourselves? My whole point is, I don't want to distinguish myself from Stevie Wonder and Prince.
Yeah.
I love them as much as I do Miles and everything else. I want all of this to be a part of what I do. I don't want the distinction, actually. The only distinction is it's coming perhaps through me, how I filter that. Just like Charlie Parker, which his language gets mislabeled as bebop, but really it's Charlie Parker's language. And all those people are his disciples, even though he might have been the same age or some older. Mm-hmm. Dizzy Gillespie, all those people, Bud Powell, they all, Bird established a new language. And all those people spoke his language, the same that Louis Armstrong did, the same that James Brown did, the same that George Clinton did, the same that Aretha Franklin did. We're establishing languages and tribes and tributaries. And to me, that is more of a proper delineation, if you will, than genre classification.
Yeah, I don't mean to go political. I mean, we've said a lot of pretty controversial things anyway, but I don't mean to go political, but within jazz, there is this idea of the sort of 1%. Mm-hmm. There is this idea that there's a few stars and they make pretty much almost all of the money. Mm-hmm. And then there's everybody else, and down to people that are playing for $5. And often it's not necessarily the case that the ones that are in the 1% are there necessarily because they're better players.
No, it's not a meritocracy.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is that, and something else I wanted to say is. Now, so in the academy, I'm try to be careful how I say this.
Or not. Go ahead. Come on, Thunder. Let it rip.
In the academy, I mean, you've seen all these surveys and all these studies that show that college professors tend to be progressive politically. I mean, 85, 90%. I mean, it's very sort of stilted in a particular direction. And I would also say that a lot of this exists in general in the arts community. And so you have an art community and in the academy where there's this tendency to be more progressive in the views. And, you know, the progressives have, you know, they have sort of branded themselves as the ones that are more socially conscious, that are more interested in uplifting black people, you know, uplifting, marginalized people and marginalized art in all of this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, bro.
But when you look at the way that these programs look around the country, in particular the jazz programs, how is it possible to have these progressive leanings and this socially conscious and, you know, I'm the defender of the black people, you know, this kind of thing, but then to see what is plain as day, as far as the inequity, as far as, you know, we have these terms, you know, diversity and inclusion, right? And I'm sorry to say that when I hear that, it just makes me sad.
Yeah, you already know.
Yeah.
You already know when you hear that word, you're outside.
No.
You're already other. Because why we got to be diverse? If we're already being fair and honest, we don't need diversity. Include us into what?
Man.
You know, and that's the problem. And to me, this is really the key point of, and I have my issues with the film, but overall, I will speak to Get Out is in these neoliberal spaces that are supposed to be tolerant. That's another word. That's a problem. Tolerant. Why do you have to be tolerated?
Yeah.
That you find the most, to me, in some sense, the more destructive forms of racism, if you will, because it comes clothed in some feeling of acceptance, but you know,
clothed in righteousness.
Yeah, you know what? But really, to be honest, I'd rather deal with the extreme, because I mean, I see that wolf. I know what it is.
Yep.
It's saying what it is. I can recognize it. They're not trying to hide it. But a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now that's the thing you gotta watch.
Yeah, man. It's rough because it's like I said, I'm done with talk.
Yeah.
I don't need to hear any more platitudes. No talking, no, I don't need you to kneel before me. I don't need you to apologize for your people, your white privilege or whatever. I don't, and actually I think it's pretentious. Actually,
It actually is. Yeah,
it's
I don't
super
even like
pretentious.
those terms.
Yeah. I don't need any of that. You know, and one thing I note also is that with a lot of this white guilt and this, checking your
so-called privilege.
Yeah, checking your privilege and all of that business. Man,
go ahead, bro. Say it, man.
Man, What? How come they never apologize for stuff that they actually did?
Wow.
You know, like,
Exactly.
you know, I would respect it so much more if someone came up and said, you know what, 2 years ago,
Mm.
I was the administrator, for such and such a bank, and I had 4 candidates come in for this job, and two of them were black and two of them were white. And on paper, I actually think that one of the black candidates was a little better,
Mm.
but because of a personal bias I had, I just hired the white guy. I just felt, you know, I just felt better about that decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say I'm sorry for that. And guess what? I'm not going to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to actually, one thing I don't like is when there's a lot of talk about systemic racism. It seems to be a whipping boy or a scapegoat to basically separate oneself from responsibility
Yeah.
of being the person that's actually in the system and executing the duties of the system. Being the person that could have made a certain decision but decided to do something else because of their own personal bias. It's a way to wash your hands of the matter without actually addressing your own culpability in promoting so-called racist policies.
Yeah.
So
Because then the conversation always becomes, well, I'm not my ancestors or my forefathers. We're not George Washington. We're not the people who subjugated you to chattel slavery. But this stuff exists today, right now. Right now. So until we can deal with it on that level, we're not really even beginning to address it. For instance, I saw a documentary last night about I won't mention this artist's name, but it's a white artist, very popular, and they sort of tried to cut their teeth in being in these very polished rock bands, and through varying degrees of failure, it didn't really work. And the thing that really popped with this artist, where they really began to sink their teeth in us and establish themselves, was through the black bands that they did work with. So they really developed their, if you will, street cred through working with these black bands. And what I found through the documentary is this person really established themselves as a chief voice in this music through the black bands. But when we looked at this person's trajectory in terms of giving back, all of their proteges were white.
Yep.
You never thought, even just by law of averages, there was no black talent. All the black artists this person worked with were already firmly established, were already who they were. All the upstarts, the people who needed a shot, who got a shot, were white systematically. There was not one black person
yeah.
who got that shot. Not one. So that really is a problem. And this is a person who hung around black people who no one would say is a racist, who if you ask them, they're not racist. But that is what racism is that it is allowed to lurk in these secret corners and masquerade as tolerance or inclusion, diversity, and so forth, but it doesn't provide the opportunities to the thing that actually put food on their table. There's
Yep.
not even a moment of giving back. And that, until we deal with it on that level, because it's like, we deal in black music, Sean. We deal, and if the people who know and love us, who we've worked with, who we've been in their homes, who we know their kids and our kids have played with each other, whatever, if they don't understand, if they do it, then what's the hope of the person who's on the far end of white nationalism and so-called supremacy? How can we ever begin to reach them if the people who we work with, who we have lunch with every day, who we teach, if they don't get it? And that's really the crux of the problem. Until we deal with it on that micro level,
Yeah. Yeah.
we don't really begin to really deal with the problem.
Yeah.
And again, yeah, it's beautiful. The NFL is going to do lift every voice and sing for the first weeks. So there's like, you know, have more black coaches, have more black quarterbacks, give Cap his job back. Let's have more black owners. Then we're really talking something. But all of this cosmetic stuff on the outside,
Yeah.
changing Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's, I don't really care about that, you know?
Yeah, and I certainly don't care about politicians wearing kente cloth.
Oh, it's almost insulting, actually.
It's super insulting.
Yeah, you know?
It's super insulting. Yeah. I even heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but I even heard that the kente cloth was from the same tribe that actually was involved in slave trade.
Well, there you go.
What?
Yeah.
What? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, praise the Lord.
Well,
Praise the Lord. You know, sometimes you got to laugh so you don't cry.
yeah.
So what do you have coming up? What projects do you want to bump? I know you said that you released a couple projects during this quarantine period.
Mm-hmm.
And then what are some things that you're looking to push out soon?
Sure. The first album that I released during this whole thing was Quarantine with Nick, which was titled as such for what we are going through right now. And it's perhaps my quickest real-time album. We did it, recorded it, mixed it, mastered it, had it out to the people in a matter of 2 weeks, starting from days before the official lockdown on Friday the 13th, Friday 13th, and it was out 2 weeks later to the people. And from my own recollection, as far as I know, perhaps the first quarantine album. Right after that, I released Maestro Rhythm King, which was inspired. The name is inspired by the drum machine that I used on the album. And that was inspired by Sly Stone's usage of the Maestro Rhythm King. It's old, kitschy, vintage drum machine he used it on There's a Riot Going On, which was an answer to Marvin Gaye's What's Going On? And Sly was like, there's a riot going on. So the Quarantine with Nick album is kind of, it starts unsettling and maybe about 3-4 tunes in before it kind of warms up, because I really wanted it to feel like COVID. I really wanted it to feel like the uncertainty and the angst and the anxiety of all the things, like a real work in time, a real work of art that may not be an easy pill to swallow, but it's how that moment felt. And then after that album, I wanted to maybe put a bomb on it, if you will. And the Maestro Rhythm King is a love record. It's a soul album, R&B album. I have a couple others in the can that I'm working on. I don't know which one I'm going to release next. One of which I will say that I thought would be my next album. However, I don't know if I'm going to release some stuff before or after. There's an album I did called The Light Beings. And that's with 2 members of Ghost Note, Sput Seawright and Mono Neon. Also Cliff Hines, who's on my Quarantined album. John Maestas, who's a guitarist from the New Mexico area, who's moved down here. And it's a very how would I say it? If I had to make a description, it's kind of like a Love Supreme, not that it sounds anything like that, just in terms of its spiritual inventiveness. And to me, that this album points to, and all this stuff that we're talking about humanity, which you know, I feel almost the same about human as I do about jazz. When we talk about race, I feel like as long as we remain human, then you're giving somebody the opportunity to humanize you or to dehumanize you, to take away your humanity. And light beings is about us ultimately being children of light, us ultimately being energy.
Mm.
So I feel like I want to be strategic in when I release that, because I kind of feel like I don't want to release that before we're ready to really approach our beings as such. When we
Mm.
transcend this body, when we really transcend race and all these false societal constructs. So really, that's what that album is about. And really, it's a suite of music called the Lightwave Suite. And each movement is named after a different wave of light,
Mm.
from radio to infrared to ultraviolet, X-rays, so on and so forth. Um, then I have another project called What is Too Black, which deals with a lot of this thing of blackness and what does that mean? Because really, as much as I talk about Black music and Black American music, on an ultimate level, I don't consider myself Black. Because
Mm.
to consider yourself Black, you're racing yourself. That is another false societal construct. However, I'm very careful not to say publicly that I'm not Black, even though in my mind, I'm not a Black person. Because when I'm pulled over on the street, I'm a Black person. And I don't want to seem haughty or elitist to my other Black brothers and sisters throughout the world who suffer from the same oppression that I do. So I don't want to be so advanced in my thinking that I'm not grounded in the ways and the realities of this world. So basically, that What is Too Black album explores those themes on race, the false construct of race, and what that means. However, I don't feel comfortable in terms of shedding this false construct until we all are ultimately liberated and free from race, until we understand it. I can't
Mm.
transcend what Black is until Black Lives Matter, even though I have
Mm.
my own issues with Black Lives Matter movement, because I just even feel like the sloganism behind it, who are you telling?
Well, you know, what one thing that I think is very clever about Black Lives Matter, about the movement, about the the leaders in the movement. Okay, so there is the nominal understanding of Black Lives Matter. I am 100% on that. But then there is the political and the sort of the political and agenda of Black Lives Matter. And some of that stuff I agree with, and some of it I don't. And some of it starts to get so far away from what it seems to mean nominally that it, you know, if the goal was to make a statement that seemed like it couldn't be argued or disputed against, and then smuggle in some other stuff, then it seems like that that it's very clever marketing. Because I mean, you have all these folks blacking out their Facebook profile and putting Black Lives Matter on their stuff, and again, it's one of those things where it's like a Band-Aid. It's not even a Band-Aid. It's like the lift every voice at the beginning of the NFL football game. But then it's like, but what are you going to actually do? So you're hip, you're woke, but how does that affect me? you know.
And as comedian artist Michael Shea said, who's been on Saturday Night Live, he's like, it's such a low bar. That's where we're starting the negotiation matters. It's not even saying Black lives are equal or Black lives are great.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
matters. Is
Right.
that's what matters? And even that is enough to draw contention.
Yeah.
So we're having that argument that we matter. So I kind of have a problem with that terminology, but I can also at the same time appreciate that if that elicits such a negative response, then that just shows us really where we are in terms of how far we have to go. That it's an argument that we matter.
Yeah.
So, and then I have problems with a lot of the other sloganisms like "I can't breathe," chanting that. Again, I'm a big person on energy. I feel we're beings of energy, and chanting that over again, "I can't breathe." Why would you do that? Why are you putting that mantra forth in the universe? Because, in my understanding of how energy works, if you repeat
Yeah.
that mantra to the world, that's what's going to come back to you. Let's not say these things. Change that narrative. We will
Yeah.
breathe, not
Yeah.
"I can't breathe." Because if you say "I can't breathe" over and over and over again every day, you're not going to be able to breathe, because that is what you're telling the universe. We need to change these ideologies and these narratives and reshape them to more to be affirmations.
Yeah, yeah, and it's and not just telling the universe, you're telling yourself that,
That, well, yes, that too.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, Nick, this has been great, man. We could keep talking. There's a lot more that could be said, but
Sure.
I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time and energy.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Is there any? Do you have a last word? Final word?
Ultimately, if you're about this cause, if you're about this movement, if you're about equity, and because we're musicians, support Black art. That's one way you can help in a very tangible way today. When people put forth their efforts, particularly Black artists, buy the project, support the projects, go to their gigs. Whenever we have gigs again, support the artists in whatever way you can. That is a real tangible way right now that we can help the people whom you purport to want to help and sustain. Reparations, that's a great argument that's on the table, but I feel like that's down the line. How you can give reparations right now is to support the artists.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can give directly. I'll directly take your reparations.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's what's happening. All right, man. Well, God
All
bless
right,
you.
bro. God bless.
All right, man.
Bam.